Hi, this is Tim with Copperhead Ag. Today we're going to be talking about our gauge wheel arm repair kits here. We have one on a John Deere 1700 series planter. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get our mud scraper off right here, and then I'll show you how we disassemble the gauge wheel arm and get assembled with our gauge wheel arm repair kit. Okay, so now we got our mud scraper off. The next thing we're going to do is take the gauge wheel arm off. This is actually the first step in our installation instructions. First the gauge wheel, then we take the whole gauge wheel arm off itself. Now these are both 15/16 inch nuts. I'm going to put on my impact here and just zip them off. Now that we got our gauge wheel arm itself off, what we need to do is go ahead and take this threaded bushing out. It's really easy to do. If you have an impact, you can hold it with one hand, but be sure to note that this is going to be full of grease, so it might get a little bit messy, but zip it out, and now our gauge wheel arm bushing is out. The next step is going to be installing our pivot pin. And with the pivot pin, there's a couple things that we're going to need to do. The first thing is we have our install bolt here. And if you see, our install bolt has a bolt and a nut, and we're going to run this nut all the way down to the end of the bolt. Then we're going to back it off about one thread. Normally I go about 4 flats. So if we're counting flats here, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we're going to put a hardened washer on the end of that so that there's a hardened washer between our nut and our pivot pin itself. An important step is you're going to want to put a little bit of oil on these threads here so that it's able to stretch and back out fine when you're torquing this down. And then when you install it, we install all the way to the bottom of the install bolt here, keeping our flats parallel with each other, so then we can slide a socket over both flats. So this takes a 15/16 inch socket. I'm going to install it by putting it over both flats, and then on these threads themselves I'm going to put some red Loctite on them. So I put the red Loctite on around the threads, make sure there's an adequate amount, and then I install it into the row unit. And then making sure we're grabbing both flats from the nut and the bolt, we're going to torque this down to 175 foot-pounds of torque. Making sure everything is tight. Now when removing the installation bolt, this is when it becomes important that we left our 4 flats of space between the nut and the bolt itself. First, you're going to want to put your wrench on there and get it on the nut only, then put your socket back over the cap screw. You're going to want to hold pressure on the cap screw, tightening while you loosen the nut. And that's going to allow you to loosen it without losing any of the torque that you applied. The next step is to install our split bushing into our gauge wheel arm itself. And we're going to do this by taking the end that has a tapered edge on it and setting it right where the threads are, and then with a rubber mallet or a press, I don't have a press so I'm going to use a rubber mallet, we're just going to tap it in. And you can see it's fully seated in there, and I have my split in there, and the split does not have to be sourced with the greaser. Because the threads are still in there, grease will run around and it will get through the split to where it needs to be. Included in the kit is 16 of these adjusting washers. For us, we're going to start out with 4 of them. Normally 4 to 5 is a good starting point. It may even get all the way up to 8 or 9. But we're going to put these here, and what these adjusting washers are going to do is control how tight our gauge wheel is to our disc opener. Once we get our first adjusting washers on, we're going to take our gauge wheel arm and slide it over the pivot pin here. And then the rest of the washers is important to put on the outside of this along with the installation assembly. Now when installing everything else, we have a few parts here. First is our cap screw. And when we go with our cap screw, the first thing we're going to put on is one of our hardened washers. And that's going to keep that from locking to our adjusting nut assembly here. So hardened washer first, and then our adjusting nut assembly goes on. So we have cap screw, hardened washer, adjusting nut assembly. Then we're going to take our concave washer here, and we're going to make it so it's bowled up if our bolt is sticking up, and we're going to put that on. And then the next thing is going to be our key lock washer. And the key lock washer is going to go right into these milled holes, slots, and that's what's going to lock everything in. Then again, we're going to put our next hardened washer on, and that's going to keep our adjusting assembly from locking onto the pivot pin. And then the remainder of the shim washers that we didn't put on the inside of the gauge wheel arm are going to go on next. At this point, everything is going to get installed and assembled. And this cap screw here is going to get torqued down to 150 foot-pounds of torque. And that again is going to be a 15/16 inch drive on your socket, and then 150 foot-pounds of torque with your torque wrench. It is very important that we do not use an impact wrench when installing any of our gauge wheel arm repair kits. So now that I got my shims figured out where they need to go, and I got my cap screw installed, and I got my gauge wheel back arm, I'm going to be able to pick this up, and it should still be able to move. Even though I have this torqued to spec, everything is tight, this arm should be able to move freely. At this point, I'm going to start tightening down my adjusting nut on the outside. And what I like to do is I pick my arm up and I adjust it until my arm stays. Once my arm stays, I'm going to back that nut off just a little bit until it falls on its own power. Once it falls, then I know I have the right adjustment on that tension. So now I can pick it up, it falls down, and it's riding right along this front edge against our disc opener. Okay, so we got everything put back together. First we got our Mudsmith gauge wheel back on, and then we have our RK Products mud scraper, and then our RK Products gauge wheel arm repair kit put together. This on the 1700 series John Deere planer is the only one where we have this separate cap screw. On all the other planers we have a adjusting nut and cap screw all as one piece. So if you have a tight split row planer that you're worried about fitting, don't worry about it, because this takes a little bit less space and it should work for everybody's application in that sense. Anyways, if you want to see more videos like this, I'm going to need you guys to subscribe or like these videos. It's just going to help us be a little bit more interactive. If we get enough going on that route, then we'll be able to put some hyperlinks, and I'll be able to make it so you can click on your product and go right through it. Otherwise, hang around and I'll show you how to navigate our website and get down to your drop list on how to order these products themselves. Thanks and have a good day.